If you guys could open up to the book of Joshua, chapter 3. We're going to pick up where Tucker left off last week. Joshua, chapter 3, we're going to start reading in verse 7. And the Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you." So as you guys know, the children of Israel are preparing for their final trek across the Red Sea, or not the Red Sea, the Jordan River. They're going into the promised land. The thing that they have anticipated for so long, 40 years, is finally at their door. Moses has passed away, and now the mantle of leadership needs to pass on to the new guy, to the successor, Joshua. And so here the Lord says to Joshua, hey, it's time to let the people know that I'm with you just like I was with Moses. And I want to pause here and kind of start off thinking about that phrase, just as I was with Moses. I want you to consider two things as we think about that. First, keep in mind that this generation of people, this people that's about to go into the promised land, this is a people that has only ever known Moses as their leader. From the time they were born, he was the person that the nation put hope in. He was the person that the nation listened to. Their parents had been born in Egypt, but their parents have all passed on. They were the generation that died in the wilderness. And so this has got to be a big monumental step to shift focus from Moses to the new guy. But secondly, I want you to think about, again, just how profound and significant those words are from the Lord. When he says, just as I was with Moses, so too I will be with you. Because when I read those, I can't help but think of Numbers chapter 12. You don't need to turn there. You can read it later if you want. But Numbers chapter 12, starting at the beginning of the chapter, we read about Moses' brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam. And they're engaging in a bout of gossip. And when you read it, it sounds an awful lot like real world gossip. Aaron and Miriam are sitting there talking, and they're frustrated for a couple of reasons. The main one being this, that Moses married a Gentile. And because Moses married a Gentile, they're a little upset because they think that he's getting too high of regard. And they say amongst themselves, we prophesy, we're leaders, God speaks to us. Why don't the people revere us as much as they revere him? Now, when you read that, the thing that really strikes me is what comes next. Because all of a sudden a voice comes out. And it's a literal voice. It's a voice that comes forth from the tabernacle of meeting where God's presence lay. And it says, Aaron, Miriam, come here. And I can't help but picture a parent who overhears their child maybe saying something he ought not and saying, hey, get over here. And that realization, oh no, what did I say? And Aaron and Miriam are brought before the Lord at the tabernacle of meeting. And what he says to them is, it's just so amazing. He says, Aaron and Miriam, in the history of my people Israel, I will speak to prophets. I will send prophets dreams and visions so that they might be able to reveal my word to my people. He says, but this is not the way it is with Moses. Moses is faithful in all my house. To him I speak as a man speaks. To him I speak face to face. Now I want to pause here and I want you to think about what he's saying. What he's saying is that he will speak to people throughout history. He will give them visions. He will give them dreams. Maybe he will have other ways that he speaks to them. But Moses is unique in that unlike every other person in history, Moses gets to speak to God as a man. He gets to literally hear God's words, and he gets to make his requests known with automatic response. He alone gets that. And what's more, I want you to think about why he gets that. God says Moses is faithful in all my house. The implication being that Moses is the best, right? He's the best of us. You've got to understand he definitely is honorable. And then he ends with these words. He says to Aaron and Miriam, so how is it you weren't afraid to speak a word against my servant Moses? And I love that because God is defending the honor of Moses. And what an amazing thing to think about. I mean, oh, what I wouldn't do to hear that God was sticking up for me, right? He's defending Moses' honor. Now, I say all of this because he now says to Joshua, I want you to know that just like I was with Moses, I'm with you. Just like I was with Moses, I'm with you. And this is a really practically important thing for the children of Israel. It's practically important because they have a lot of work to do. And they need to keep together. And if they don't recognize Joshua as the man, if they're not willing to listen to him, then they might not be able to fulfill this mission of going into the promised land and claiming it as their own. But what's more, guys, there's a principle underlying all of this. And that's this, that Israelites don't need Moses to go into the promised land. And the day's coming when Joshua will die, and they'll find they don't need him either. And when Joshua dies, the scriptures tell us that Israel is led by elders, a group of elders. And when they die, it's kind of led by nobody. Periodically, judges will come up, and they will be people around whom the people will rally. But until the coming of a king, the people, in essence, are supposed to be following the Lord. And what I love about that is, we're sheep, right? We want shepherds. We are drawn to people as leaders, and we look to them to guide us and to instruct us and to teach us. It's hard when a leader goes away, he dies, moves somewhere else, goes about a different task or job or something, or he disappoints us or whatever. It's hard after that because we often find ourselves going, what do we do now? And the answer is, the Lord is the same Lord, and he is the leader. And so Joshua is going to go into the promised land, and he's going to lead the people, but really it's the same leader that it's always been. It's the Lord. And so let's carry on. Verse 8. You shall command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, saying, when you have come to the edge of the water of the Jordan, you shall stand in the Jordan. So just remember that as they're coming into the land, there is one clear physical barrier that cuts them off from the land, and that is the river Jordan. Verse 9, so Joshua said to the children of Israel, come here and hear the words of the Lord your God. And Joshua said, by this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. Now I want to pause here. And I want to reflect back on these words. Joshua, of course, was told that he has to do something to demonstrate to the people that God is with him, just as he was with Moses. Joshua turns that around, though, and he says, you all have to see something so that you know, not that God is with me, but that God is going before you and is going to drive these people out of the land. And to think about this, as you reflect on this, you should remember the history, right? The history is that the children of Israel, having come out of Egypt by a mighty hand, God saved them. God delivered them in a way that could clearly only be said to be him. 10 plagues miraculously brought upon the Egyptians. The Israelites set free, going to their destination, to their storied home, the home that had been promised to their forefather, Abraham. And on their way, they receive word that the Egyptians are coming after them. And as they go on their way, they come across the worst barrier you could imagine, the Red Sea, right? And when they're there, they cry out and they say, why did you ever bother to save us, God? Why didn't you just kill us in Egypt? Were there not enough graves there? And so what does God do? God performs the miracle of miracles, probably the grandest miracle seen in the scriptures. And when I say grandest, I mean the one seen by more people, the one that seems the least possible, the parting of the Red Sea. The Red Sea splits and walls of water on both sides, and 1 million+ people cross over on dry land, free from Egypt forever. And they're in the desert. And you would think they would be able to sit there and go, yes, we're free. We'll never have to worry about going back to Egypt again. Pharaoh has no control over us. But what happens? They run out of water, and then they say, we wish we were in Egypt. Because in Egypt, we may have been slaves, but at least we had water. So what does Moses do? He performs miracles to bring them water. In one instance, he turns a bitter lake sweet by putting a piece of wood in it. Clearly a miracle. That doesn't turn bitter waters sweet. In another instance, because it happened not once, but actually didn't just happen twice, happened multiple times. In another instance, they're complaining and crying out, saying that they're going to die of thirst. So Moses says, okay, Lord, what do you want me to do? God says, there's a rock over here. Strike the rock with your rod. Water will pour forth. So he does. He strikes the rock. Water comes gushing out of the rock. The people come and they drink. And at this point, of course, you would think they all go, we get it. God is actually for us. God is actually going to protect us. He's actually going to take care of us. But they don't. because then they start complaining about the fact that they're hungry. And they say, if only we were still slaves in Egypt, because in Egypt we had plenty of food to eat. Leeks and onions, they would say, which I don't know why leeks and onions were things that would call them back to slavery. So what does God do for them? He causes it to rain bread daily. To rain bread every single day. And you would think by this point they would go, we get it. He is actually with us. He's actually going to take care of us. By the way, did I forget to mention, he is actually with them in a way that he's never been with anybody else ever. Every single day, by a cloud of smoke and a pillar of fire, he is actually present amongst the people. They can actually point at him. If somebody in Israel were to say, I don't know if I believe in God, their parents could go, look, there. That thing that makes a lot of noise when he talks to Moses, that's God, the guy who split the Red Sea. You would think that these guys, having seen more than anybody else in history, would have the utmost confidence. Yes, God is with us, God is real, and God is going to take us where he promises us. But as you guys know, when they finally get to the promised land, when they get to this same spot they're at right now, just this side of the Jordan River, they send spies in. And the spies come back, and well, they send 12 in, all of them but 2. 10 of them say, guys, we can't go in there. We cannot go into that land. It's scary. The people there are giants. We are like grasshoppers in their eyes, and they live in walled cities, and the walls are so high, there's nothing we could do about it. Like, they would destroy us if we went in there. And when everybody hears it, they're like, man, why did we ever come on this trip? What are you doing, Moses? Do you want to kill us? And at this point, God finally says, okay, that's it. You're not going to get in the land. This generation that saw more than any other generation in history said, God can't do it. So finally, God says, we're not letting these people in. They're going to die in the wilderness. This whole generation is going to live for 40 years in the wilderness, and they're going to die out, and their story is going to be over. It'll be their children who did not grow up in Egypt. Their children who, although they grew up seeing miracles, yes, I want you to think about this. They grew up seeing miracles. They didn't know them to be miracles because they were just the thing that always happened. They grew up eating bread that rained, and so they just thought, of course, it just rains bread every day. They grew up needing water. They just went to that rock that Moses struck. That, those kinds of things. They were taken care of by that, so they never knew that there was something special about them and about what was happening. And now they're being called to go into the promised land. They're being called to step into the river of the Jordan. And what they're told is, and God is going to drive those people who scared your parents, he's going to drive them out before you. Look at verse 11. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is crossing over before you into the Jordan. Now therefore, take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man from every tribe. Now I want to pause here. That just kind of hangs in the middle of this chapter, and then he changes subject a little bit, and it's not going to come back up until next chapter, so I'll just leave that for Tucker next week, okay? So just kind of lock that away. Verse 13, and it shall come to pass, as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, as soon as they shall rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, the waters that come down from upstream, and they shall stand as a heap. Now I want you to note, we're going to finish this chapter here in just a second. What you're going to find is more or less this same story, the same wording is repeated 3 times. And all of Joshua chapter 3 and 4 follow that pattern. There's a repetition of 3 of the same thing so that you kind of find it tedious. What's happening is God tells Joshua that he's going to do something. Joshua tells the people that they're going to do something, and then it happens. So 3 times they tell you the same thing. So we've already seen this once, and now Joshua's telling the people that this is going to happen. But I want you to think about what is going to happen. The priests are supposed to take the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders. The Ark of the Covenant, of course, that box in which is held the tablets, right, the 10 Commandments, in which is held Aaron's rod that budded, and a jar of manna in commemoration of what happened when God fed them in the wilderness. They're going to be carrying that, but more importantly than what's in it, more important than what is in it, is what it signifies. The Ark of the Covenant is considered the throne of God, the presence of God, and only the priests are allowed to touch it. So they pick it up, they put it on their shoulders, and they march, and what do? They walk into the Jordan. That's the plan. Now, I want you to note, they walk into the Jordan before the Jordan stops flowing. So the waters are still moving when they go in. Let's finish the chapter and we'll come back to that point. Verse 14. So it was, when the people set out from their camp to cross over the Jordan, with the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people, and as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, here it is, the feet of the priests who bore the ark dipped into the edge of the water. And notice this parenthetical statement. For the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of harvest. I want you to note, when does God have them come into the promised land? It's when the Jordan is overflowing. Why? Because God wants to make it really clear that it was he who did it. He wants to make it really clear that when the floodwaters of the Jordan are cut off and the waters run past the Israelites and the rest stand up on a heap, he wants to make it really clear that this was a miracle. This is not the kind of thing men can accomplish. Okay, now this is, I think, so ironic because contemporary culture, the modern day world, modern scholars, if you will, Christian scholars, they actually like to say that the crossing of the Jordan was actually explainable by natural reasoning, that actually the waters were especially low at that particular time. I don't know why they say that. The only bit of the story that we have is here when it says that they're flooded. And they say that there are some ways that basically at a certain time, if the water could have gotten diverted and it'd be dry ground and you could cross over. Here's the thing. If you don't want to believe the Bible, don't believe the Bible, but just admit that you're not believing the Bible. Don't sit there and take what the Bible is saying and say it says something else, right? The Bible is saying that the floodwater, that the Jordan was at a flood stage, that it was overrunning its bank. It was bigger than it usually is, and God has cut it off. And so the people are going to cross over on dry ground. Carry on. That the waters which came down from upstream stood still and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zaretan. So the waters that went down into the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, that is the Dead Sea, failed and were cut off, and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Then the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over. I like how it repeats itself over and over like that. All the people crossed over until all the people completely, entirely had crossed over. So I want to stop here for a second and kind of shift gears a little bit. I hope you have firmly set, before I do this, just what has happened. The priests have gone into the river. When their feet touch the river, the water's cut off. They're now gathered up in a mound upstream. They stand in the midst of the riverbank, and all the people cross. And understand, this is not something that happens in a snap. There's over 1 million of these people. Over 1 million people are crossing over on dry ground. This is an ordeal that takes a long time. And what I want to do, having that picture in your mind, is I want to shift gears from the actual event to kind of what inspired me to share this today. So it was about a week and a half ago. Tucker and I were talking. We met up to discuss what I was going to be teaching on. And I had actually kind of planned something out already. But Tucker was like, actually, we're going back to the book of Joshua. And I'm going to be picking up in chapter 3. Do you think you could pick up with the end of chapter 3? And when I thought about it, I thought, yes, that would be perfect, actually, for what was kind of personally going on in my heart and in my mind. When I realized that Joshua chapter 3 is about the crossing of the Jordan River. And so when he told me that, I thought, oh, this is going to be perfect. I'm going to know exactly what I want to talk about. Because what I want to talk about is heaven. I want to talk about heaven. And the thing is that historically, and I want to be careful here. I don't want to over-allegorize anything, which I am allegorizing. I'm not usually a big fan of allegory, but I have a reason for this. So let me start off, before I go any further, by pointing out, guys, that the story of the crossing of the Jordan, it happened. It's a fact. It's history. And it's a historical event that is very important to a particular group of people, the Jewish nation. It's foundational to who they are as a people and to explaining why and how they got the land, which is their own, that they inhabit to this day. Okay, so I want to start off by just affirming that. Secondly, by pointing out that nonetheless, in the history of the church, Christians have long taken a look at different passages of Scripture and have noticed that even if they're recounting historical events, that they tell us stories that apply to kind of life in general, to universal stories. And I'd like to point out the apostles make use of this. Paul himself kind of gives a little bit of credence to what I'm talking about in 1 Corinthians when he compares the crossing of the Red Sea to baptism. He says that when the Israelites crossed over the Red Sea, they went through the baptism of Moses, is what he called it. And so, I have that. And then also, just that historically, that has been very common for Christians to interpret the Jordan River as a symbol of death and the crossing of the Jordan River into the Promised Land as a symbol or an allegory of going into heaven. And so I thought this is going to be perfect. I'm going to explain why that's perfect here in a second. Because I don't know if you were here last week, but Tucker got up here in the pulpit. I was sitting over there first hour, and Tucker goes, "Now guys, crossing the Jordan, going into the Promised Land is not about heaven." And I thought, oh man, I'd already planned my sermon. I was like, Tucker, what am I going to do? And I was even literally going to make reference to a couple of different arguments to kind of show that I'm not just pulling this up out of thin air, that Christians have long done this. I was going to refer to the book Pilgrim's Progress. I don't know if you guys have read Pilgrim's Progress, but just an FYI, in Pilgrim's Progress, it's an allegory of a man on a journey. It's supposed to represent the Christian life. And this man named Christian ends up just this side of the Jordan River in a land called Beulah. And when it's time for him to die, he crosses the Jordan River, death, and then goes to the celestial city, heaven, where God is. So I'm like, see, there's another bit of proof. Tucker literally mentioned that book and said something to the effect of that not being a proper interpretation. And then the other one is, of course, old slave spirituals, right? The spiritual songs written by slaves in the 17th and 18th century in America, very focused on heaven, right? Because these guys they have no hope. There is no chance of escaping their horrible lot in life. And so what are they longing for? What are they looking for? Heaven, heaven, heaven. Tucker comes in and says, disregard the spiritual, disregard Pilgrim's Progress. It's not about heaven. And I thought, man, what am I going to do now? Thankfully, now let me start off. I talked about it. He said I can say what I'm going to say. But let me also add this, that I actually totally agree with him. I don't think that the best allegory for the crossing of the Jordan River, going to the Promised Land, is necessarily heaven. Because, of course, once the people cross the Jordan River and get into the Promised Land, there's still wars to fight. There's still battles to be won. There's still hardships. And I know that that's not what's going to be in heaven or in the resurrection. So I acknowledge that his interpretation is correct. But it's useful to me to be able to use this other one. And I don't think it's unjustified. And I don't think it's unjustified because what else do we see when we see a group of people who were once slaves, like we were once slaves to sin, who are freed from that slavery by the power of God, and who go through the waters of baptism at the Red Sea, as Paul pointed out, and then come into this new place where we're free, but things are still hard, and where we struggle, and where we fight, and sometimes we're afraid, and sometimes we find ourselves saying, if only I could go back to Egypt, if only I could go back to my slavery. We find ourselves saying those things. And what better picture of heaven than this idea that there's a promise awaiting us, and I can get to it. And that's what I'm longing for and hoping for. And we're going to see this soon, but the book of Hebrews actually lends some credence to that, because the book of Hebrews in chapter 11 is going to describe our heavenly home as a homeland, as a promised land. So I think I have some justification in it. I agree with Tucker on that. He says it's fine for me to say what I'm going to say. Just wanted to make sure to bring that up in case you were sitting there going, wait a minute, you're literally contradicting Tucker from last week. So we're all good on this. But let me explain why I wanted to talk about heaven today. I want to talk about heaven, and not just about heaven. I want to talk about the hope of heaven and living a heavenly life. Because, as I said at the start of this message, it's been 1 year since I preached up here. And I remember that very vividly because it was the next day when I woke up and I got a text from a mom at my school who also goes to our church telling me that one of my former students who just graduated, Jeffrey O'Brien, was killed in a motorcycle accident. And so, I knew coming into this weekend that it would mark the 1-year anniversary of his passing into heaven. And I knew that I'd be getting together with his family. His grandparents are here, just right in front of me. I knew I'd be getting together with his family on Friday night, and I knew we'd be celebrating Jeffrey's heavenversary, as his family called it. So I knew that was very much in my mind. And then also, just a couple of days before Tucker and I talked about what passage to teach, an old roommate of mine, one of my dear friends who had a huge impact on me and my spiritual growth in my younger years, he passed away due to colon cancer. And after his passing, I got to observe his family and their response to his passing. And so what I've had in my mind is heaven. And not just from those two situations. I don't know if it's true, but this year, at least in my life, with people that I know and love and care about, it seems that there's been way more death than I'm used to seeing, way more impactful death. And so I'm sure it's different for different people, but last year was a rough one in that sense for me. And the thing that got me in watching the O'Brien family and watching my friends is this unbelievable belief that they were going to see their loved one in heaven. And not just that, but that they were longing for that. And there was a joy in it, that there was a celebration in it. As I looked at them, I thought, oh my goodness, heaven is so real to them. And the big thing that I thought is, and it's not for me. Like, I've lost some of that. I thought back to my younger years when I had, I think, that excitement kind of when I first really started walking with the Lord. I had that belief that anything in this world was kind of useless. It's kind of a bad mindset to have when you're in college. But I do remember thinking, like, I don't need to be taking college classes that are going to get me a good job because I don't care about a good job. I just want to think about Jesus and talk about Jesus and these things. I was very much mindful about heaven. But in my own life, this has changed, right? As I've grown older, I've just come to think less and less about it. And the big thing that gets me to think less and less about it are all the little things in the world that distract me from it. The cares, the concerns, the stresses, the strains. I just bought a house. I've never owned my own house before. Highly stressful enterprise if you've not done that. The big thing for me that really struck me is once upon a time, actually all my life, if something broke at my house, somebody else took care of it. And now I'm super stressed, like, what if something breaks? If something breaks, I have to pay for it. And will I be able to pay for it? I don't know. Like, and what happens if I can't pay for it? What is going to happen to me, you know? That's the kind of stuff that goes on in my mind. And I'm focused on that. I'm focused on work. I am a teacher and I have to grade papers and I hate grading papers and I procrastinate it and I think about it all the time because I think about how I've got to get stuff done so that I can live a somewhat happy and well-adjusted life. But those are the things I'm thinking about. Those are my concerns. And frankly, the heavenly things in my life, things like preaching at church, things like just sitting down and doing a simple Bible study, spending time in prayer, those things increasingly feel like something to get through rather than something to look forward to. It's something that I need to do so I can get done with it, so I can get on doing the thing that I want to do, right? And so I have a couple of things I want you to consider as we reflect on these people who crossed into the water, saw the cutting off of the water, and then they got to experience the promised land. First, I want you to note something very important. The priests and the people, they stepped in the waters. One thing that is not so much a point as much as it is a kind of a backdrop that you need to understand is that a life lived for heaven is a life of action. It's a life of doing. It is not a life of indolence and laziness. It is a life in which you step out in faith, in which you take risks in a sense, and you do it always having your eye fixed on the prize, recognizing that there is something that you're moving towards that is more important than all of the things around you. It's kind of a backdrop. I'm going to illustrate what that means, but to do that, I really want to focus in on two main things that we have to consider when considering what it means to live a heavenward life, to make heaven the focus of our lives. And the first, you don't need to turn here, but you might jot it down. Matthew 6, verses 19 and 20. Matthew 6, verses 19 and 20. Jesus says, "Do not store up your treasures on the earth, where moths devour and where rust destroys and where thieves can break in and steal. Instead, store up your treasures in heaven. For where your treasures are, there your heart will be also." It's the first verse that came to my mind when I thought of my friends. Not just, by the way, the friends from the last couple of weeks. Like I said, it's been all year. I've seen this time and time again in believers who have lost. It's, guys, their treasure is in heaven. They, of course, love heaven and want it because their treasure is there. And when I first thought that, I thought, oh, it's their lost loved one. But here's the thing. They could have never had that treasure in heaven if they hadn't first had a bigger treasure there, which is the love of the Lord himself. This belief that he is the most important and that they're going to see him again. For where their treasure is, that's where their heart is. So, of course, they're going to delight in heaven and they're going to be excited. They're going to be so excited for him to come back. And the thing is, as I read this, I think about all the things in my life that are my treasures. If you're wondering, if you're sitting here wondering, is my treasure heaven? Is my treasure the Lord himself and being with him? Ask yourself this question. This is something somebody posed to me and I thought this was so applicable. Ask yourself, if you weren't doing anything else, what would you be doing? And they said, that's usually a pretty good indicator of what your treasure is. And as I thought about it, I thought, if I wasn't doing anything else, would I be sharing the gospel of Christ to the lost? Would I be ministering to the brokenhearted? Would I be seeking the scriptures, reading them, studying them? Would I be engaging in conversations with other believers? Would I be singing hymns with friends or worship songs? Or is that what I do in my free time? Is that what I do when my heart is done with its tasks? Does my heart go to that? Or does it go to something else entirely? And it honestly, so please don't feel convicted, be convicted. Conviction is good. Don't feel condemned if you couldn't answer that with the affirmative, because I can't answer it with the affirmative either. What do I do when I have nothing else to do? Frankly, I watch movies most of the time. I watch movies, I read books, I hang out with friends, I play games, I do those kinds of things. And that's the stuff I look forward to. I look forward to Bible study being over so I can go play the next game, or so that I can go hang out with my friend. I look at prayer and I pray first thing in the morning, not because we got to make sure to do the best first, but because I want to get it over with first thing in the morning so that I can do all the things I actually want to do. And to be able to get past that mindset and to come to that point where my treasure is in heaven, where what I really want is to find that next person who's never heard of Jesus. What I really want is to find that person who's brokenhearted and show them how Jesus can meet them in their brokenness. What I really want is to just spend more time with the Lord, to get myself to that point. Oh, it's so hard. I think about what Jesus even said, kind of an illustration of this point, leading up to that. Remember, he says that when you're giving, right, when he talks about giving money, he says, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. His point being, if you let everybody see what you're giving and how much you're giving, if you want people to know, then what is your actual treasure? Your treasure is for people to look at you and say, wow, you gave a lot of money. That's good. Which, by the way, that goes very deep into our subconscious and psyche, right? As a child, when my grandpa would give me coins, I used to put it in the offering box, like, let everybody know just how much I gave, right? Because my heart is with people, and I want people to love me. Or he says, when you pray, don't make long prayers in the streets to be seen by all. He says, because you've received a reward. Instead, when you pray, go into the secret place and there pray to God. And then God, who sees in secret, will reward you openly. Where is your treasure? That's the first thing. These people who crossed the Jordan River, they knew their treasure was on the other side. They knew that there was no treasure here. Their parents, the generation that went before, they thought the treasure was back. These people know it's forward, so they can step in. They can move forward. Second thing, and here I will ask you to turn with me, if you would, turn to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, locate verse 13. The book of Hebrews chapter 11 focuses on faith. It starts off by explaining what faith is, And then it gives a recounting of several great men and women of the Old Testament and how they took steps of faith. The person who's highlighted most in this chapter is Abraham. Abraham, who was called from his homeland in Ur to walk to a city he knew not what. Meaning literally God told him, hey, Abraham, leave your house, leave your home, leave your extended family. He, of course, took his wife with him. Leave your extended family and leave everything behind. Well, not everything. He brought his stuff with him. But leave and go to a place I'm going to show you. He didn't take him, he didn't like give him a map. He didn't give him a GPS and say, hey, there's this one place that's really beautiful. Here's some pictures. He said, just start walking and I will take you there. And what does Abraham do? He walks. He does it. There are several other examples in the chapter of things Abraham does, like the time God tells him to take his son, his only son whom he loves, and offer him up on Mount Moriah as a sacrifice. And what does he do? He does it. He takes these steps because he has a different focus from the rest of us. The rest of us want to stay home. The rest of us want to be in our comfort. The rest of us want to make sure that we're provided for. Another example, of course, Moses, who we've already talked about. Where does Moses start off his life? He's the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He has wealth and prestige and importance and the comforts of life, better comforts than anybody had ever had. But by faith, he says, I have to protect my countrymen, these slaves. And so he does. And as a result, has to flee for his life and has to live for 40 years as a shepherd out in the wilderness, separated from his family, from his people, from society. These are steps of faith that these people took. Why? Because they believed in something that was beyond the here and the now. Look here at chapter 11, verse 13. These all died in faith. All the guys that they talked about, Abraham, Moses, they died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Guys, they died in faith, not having received the promises. You know what happened to Abraham when he finally got there into the promised land? God said, walk around for a while, for the rest of your life, actually. And then at some point he says, Abraham, see all this land? It's all going to be yours 400 years after you die. 400 years after you die. He left his home. He left everything he knew because God gave him a promise that he was going to possess a land. And when he got there, God said, there's this little hitch. You're not going to get it until 400 years after you die. And he was okay with that. He was okay with that. Moses, what happened to Moses? Guys, I talked about him being like the greatest man ever, most important man ever. His life was largely a failure. Aside from that first 40 years where he had some comforts, his next 40 years, he lived in obscurity. I don't know how good or bad his life was. It was simple, so that's actually probably good. But then he's called to go back to Egypt. He's called to go save his people. And for 1 year and a half long period, he felt triumphant. Because he walked in there, he confronted Pharaoh. He said, let my people go. He called down the 10 plagues. The people were set free. He walks across the dry ground with the Red Sea. He goes into the desert. He goes up onto Mount Sinai. He gets the tablets. God speaks to him. He's revered by all. He leads them up to the promised land. And then they refuse to go. And he's told he's got to spend another 40 years. He lived to be 120. He has to live another 40 years wandering. Man, and the whole time just thinking, I just can't wait to get to that promised land. But you guys know the story, right? What ends up happening is at some point over the course of this little process, he ends up being told by some people that they need water. So he goes back to that same rock, that rock that was following them. God says, speak to the rock. The water will just come forth from the rock. And Moses, instead of speaking to the rock, turns to the people and says, must we bring water from this rock, you rebels? And then he strikes the rock and the water comes forth. But then God says to Moses, because you didn't hallow me, because you didn't honor me, you don't get to go in the promised land. Which is just it's just the saddest thing in the scriptures. I'm like, really, God? Moses? That just doesn't seem like that bad of a thing. I mean, and you'll hear sermons explaining it. I got to say, I've never heard a sermon that made me go, oh, that makes sense. You know what I mean? And I'm not trying to second guess God. I want to be reverent with that. Like, I know God did what's right, but my point is that it makes no sense to me. What I'm saying is that it's not something that's humanly comprehensible. Moses doesn't get to see the promised land. And guys, it's so much sadder. Deuteronomy, you don't need to turn here, but Deuteronomy 3, verse 23, Moses goes to God and says, please let me see the promised land. Please, I just want to go. And God said, don't speak to me about it again. You're not going in. Just so sad. But Moses died in faith, not having received the promise. In fact, I will put a mark here because we're going to come back to Hebrews 11, but do turn with me to Deuteronomy, the last chapter. This is Deuteronomy 34. Because when it came time for Moses to die, he did go to the people. He brought up Eleazar to be anointed the new high priest. He brought out Joshua to be anointed the new leader of the people. He gave a final farewell sermon to the people. And then he went off with God, and God said to Moses, Moses, I'm not going to let you in, but I'm going to take you to the top of Mount Nebo. I'm going to take you to the top of the mountain, and I'm going to show it to you. I want you to at least see it. Before you die, I'm going to let you see it. And so he takes him up there, and it's funny. It doesn't explain what God being with Moses on that mountain looked like. I don't know if he was in a human form, but I picture him walking with Moses up on the mountain, just like God had said, walked in the coolness of the garden with Adam. And look here at verse 4 of chapter 34. Moses says, then the Lord said to him, this is the land of which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over. Here it is, Moses, look at it. This is what I promised to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what I promised to give to his descendants. It's the land I called you to. You're not going to get to go in, but I'm going to let you see it. And then look at verse 5. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And this verse, it always gets me. It says, and he, that is God, buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his grave to this day. God buried him. I picture God up there with Moses, his friend. I picture Moses dying, and I picture God literally doing the hard stuff of digging a hole, getting his hands dirty, because he loves this man so much. And he buries him by himself and has a funeral just for himself. And then it says, and no one knows where he is to this day. It's almost like God is saying, I wanted to keep this one special. This is mine. I alone visit Moses. And that's because Moses died in faith, not having received the promise. Let's go back to Hebrews 11. He died in faith, not having received the promise. Verse 13, but having seen them afar, he was assured of them. He embraced them and he confessed that he was a stranger and a pilgrim in the earth. Abraham and Moses could say, I can embrace a promise that's 400 years down the road because I am a stranger on the earth. Look on. For those, verse 14, who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland, a new land to call their own. And truly, if they had called to mind the country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. Like they could have gone back. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And so, guys, the point of this little section is to tell you to have that heavenly vision. Make sure your treasure's in heaven, but you've got to have this vision of where you're going. You've got to know what the destination is, and that has to be the thing that matters. So that when you don't get this promised land, that is the earthly promised land, it's okay because you have that heavenly promised land. And so that when you come to that land that God called you to and you thought you were going to get a house and a piece of land and you thought everything was going to be great, it's okay because you have the sight of faith and you can see off in the distance and you know this isn't the whole story, that God has something much bigger, much better planned. And that starts to be the thing that you long for. That starts to be the thing that you desire. I leave off with one final example of this kind of in the real world. One of my heroes, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I think Tucker actually mentioned last week as well, but different context. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German pastor who lived in Germany during the rise of the Third Reich and the rise of Hitler. And quite early in Hitler's reign, came to the realization that he was going to, as a pastor, because of his conviction, he was going to have to oppose Hitler. Early on, he signed on to a group that has become known as the Confessing Church. The Confessing Church were German Christians who got together and said, there is no Führer but Christ. Christ alone is our master and our Lord. Many of those guys signed that from Switzerland, where they were safe. Not Bonhoeffer. He did it in Germany. He actually had a chance to go to America, and he did actually go to America, and decided to come back because he felt that he could only really do any good if he suffered with his people right now. Step of faith, because his treasure was somewhere else. He sent his fiancée to go live in America, just in case anything were to happen to her, knowing full well he may never get to the earthly promised land and get to marry her and have a family like he always wanted. He sends her to protect her, but he stays in Germany to minister to the needs of the people and to oppose Hitler. And on a couple of occasions to try to assassinate Hitler. He took part in a couple of assassination attempts. One got very close to killing him. And it was that one that caused Hitler to crack down on these groups. And it was in that crackdown that Bonhoeffer gets arrested. He's sent to prison and ultimately to a concentration camp. Now, there's two things I want to point out that happened later in his life. The first one was while in prison, he wrote a letter that I read to his brother. And in the letter he writes, I woke up this morning and I read the Psalms. It is the joy of my life. When he wrote that, I just thought, or when I read that, I thought, how? How could you be at that place where I read the Psalms too, but I read the Psalms because I'm supposed to. He read the Psalms because it's the joy of his life. And it would be about a year later, and it would be right just a couple of days before the concentration camp he's in was to be liberated, that Hitler would issue a decree saying, hey, we need to take care of these political prisoners. The political prisoners need to go. And so the camp decides it's time to bring all these political prisoners out and put them to death. The morning that the decree comes down, Bonhoeffer is in a room with a bunch of his fellow camp members, a bunch of Jewish guys, and they're praying for each other. And the guard comes in and calls Bonhoeffer away, and Bonhoeffer follows him, and he takes him to a little room. Bonhoeffer walks in that room, and there's that same Bible on a bed. And he goes, and what does he do? He opens it up and reads the Psalms. On his knees. He's on his knees reading the Psalms. And a couple hours go by, and the guard comes back, opens the door, and Bonhoeffer looks up at him and says, is it time? And the guard says, yes. He puts his Bible down, he gets up, and he follows the guard. And he walks him to the gallows, and Bonhoeffer walks up the gallows, and as he comes to the edge, he stops, and he turns around, and he looks at that same guard, and he says, this is the end, but for me, the beginning of life. And then he goes and is hanged and begins life. Now, I want to leave that with you because I want you to think about one thing in particular. There was a man right there who had a vision of heaven, who had a hope of heaven. And every single thing he did in his life pointed to that hope of heaven. And it was all, in my mind, encapsulated in that one statement when he said, I read the Psalms this morning. It is the joy of my life. And so what my word to you would be, you want to have your treasure in heaven? You want to have that vision of heaven? We got to emulate that kind of stuff. We got to practice that in our lives and get our focus back on what really matters.